them, but the last one was a postal history of Malta. He's given us one about another one. I was back when we were at the centre. I saw about a political history of Malta. They're always really brilliant and insightful, and we're lucky to have him here tonight. Thank you very much, Albert.
Ok, va bene, ci siamo. Okay.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Well, as you know from previous presentations to the MHA, and I have been associated with the MHA for most of the years that I've been in Australia, and I was just telling Robert I'm somewhat disappointed that the meetings aren't any longer held in Parkville, because I would have liked to see some of my old friends. But as you know from my previous presentations to the MHA, I have a range of interests, which is very important, especially when you retire. And one of them is the hobby which goes back to when I was a child, which was at that stage, I would have called it stamp collecting. It evolved as I grew more interested in the history of stamps into what we call philately. And eventually, as I reached completion in my collection of Maltese stamps, I then started to study the postal history of Malta, which is a very, very fascinating subject, keenly followed by many specialist collectors. We have a society called the Malta Study Circle. It is based in the United Kingdom, but it has members in many countries, including Malta. I myself am a member, and I shall be referring to the work of this society in this talk, because the society is an extremely learned society which publishes many important books and articles on the postal history of Malta. Today, I'm going to talk to you about something which I think many Maltese today are not aware of, which is the presence of prisoners of war in Malta during the First World War. Now, many people do not think about the First World War, which was fought between 1914 and 1918. The actual peace treaty, which ended most, not all, of the hostilities, was signed in 1919. But this war, my friends, is still going on, because the origin of most of the wars which succeeded this First World War come directly from that war. And even today, much of the grief in the world can be, by scholarly research, shown to originate through decisions and outcomes of this war. For example, the genocide in Palestine is definitely the result of a decision in the First World War. The attack by the Russian Empire of today on the Ukraine can be traced to that war. And even the rise of fascism in the United States, as we see it now, has its origin in American isolationism, which started in the wake of the First World War, when the United States refused to join the League of Nations. So let us get into a bit of an introduction about our subject today. And as everybody who studies the First World War knows, the spark which led to the explosion occurred when the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this is an empire which no longer exists, was assassinated in what today is Bosnia, in the town of Sarajevo. And this led to an escalation in relation to measures by Austria-Hungary and Germany to use this event to increase their hegemony in Europe. Obviously, the rival imperialist powers weren't going to stand for this, and gradually, in August of that year, 1914, the war was officially started. Italy, in contrast to the Second World War, entered the war on the side of the Allied powers. The powers in the First World War were called the Allied powers, consisting of England and France, joined later by Italy, and finally by the United States, and some other small powers who are not as important, and what was called the Central Powers, which were basically Austria and Hungary, and then Germany, and Austria-Hungary and Germany, and then Turkey, which went on the side of the Central Powers. Because of the fact that Italy, unlike the Second World War, was not involved as a combatant against Britain, Malta was not as involved in the theatre of war as it was in the Second World War. Malta, however, had a very important role as a base of support for the British and French fleets, a very important role in providing hospital services to the wounded, especially those wounded in the Egyptian and the Turkish Gallipoli-Darandel campaign. And since Malta was a colony of the British, several things happened in relation to the topic which I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about. First of all people which were of German or Austrian citizenship who were then in Malta, and there were a few, most of them were business people, okay, they were immediately arrested and interned, okay? Gradually, these people were joined by combatant personnel from German and Austrian ships, which were either in ports controlled by the British or captured near Malta. And at first, these prisoners were relatively low in number, and they were interned in what were called the casemate barracks in Floriana. Nowadays, these barracks hardly exist because they were practically blown to pieces in the Second World War. But in those days, these barracks were first used to accommodate these prisoners of war, and you can debate whether they could be called prisoners of war or internees. They were actually a mixture of prisoners of war and internees. Gradually, more and more prisoners or internees found their way into these barracks as the British proceeded to intern other citizens of the Austro-Hungarian and German empires who were under their control through living, for example, in Egypt. And they were shipped to Malta, and larger camps were established in the Cotonera area on the east side of Grand Harbor. And these camps consisted, and I shall show this in detail, of the Verdala barracks, which we know about today. And there was also a camp adjacent, you'll see the geography of these camps in a few minutes, which was called St. Clement's Camp. And this camp was not consisting of actual housing accommodation, actual roofs over your head, but this consisted of a gradually very large, if you like, village of tents. And this move took place from the casemate barracks on the 3rd of November 1914, and this was immediately followed by nearly 600 civilian and German and Austrian, they're called prisoners of war in this article, arriving from Egypt, and then in the 1st of December, another 564. So you're realizing then that by the end of 1914, over 1,000 of these prisoners of war were already in Malta. As a result of the declaration of war with the Turkish Empire, with the Ottoman Empire, Turkish internees, mostly civilians, were also transferred from Egypt to Malta in November 1914. By the end of May, their number went up to 150. We shall come again to the subject of Turkish internees towards the end of this talk. Every prisoner of war, starting from the number 1, was allocated a sequential number. And just to give you an idea of how many people we're talking about here, by the time hostilities ended in November 1918, there were about 2,650 of these numbers. They had been allocated. However, we know that throughout the war, some prisoners were either released or transferred abroad. So it doesn't mean that this many prisoners were in Malta, but the number which were retained in Malta was certainly over 2,000. And these included many eminent people. The Austrian, for example, Aurelius Dunich, interned in 1914, later occupied the post of conductor of the camp orchestra, and I shall be talking to you about the activities of the prisoners in this camp, because they formed a community. They weren't just prisoners behind bars waiting and feeling frustrated. They also formed a community, and they had many activities, which I shall describe. It is important to note that Aurelius Dunich, after the war, settled in Malta, and he was director of the King's Own Band in Valletta, an interesting factoid. Now, this graph, which is taken from a book which I shall show you later, gives us a pictorial representation of the way in which these prisoners arrived in Malta. So you can see the two large groups which arrived in November and December 1914. Now observe the third large group of 1914. On the 6th December, 150 survivors from SMS Emden arrived in Malta. I shall describe these people in much more detail in a few minutes. These were combatants. They were sailors from a ship, a warship, which was sunk by the Allies, and they arrived in Malta. But there is interesting information about these people, and there is a connection to Australia. Then there were German soldiers which were captured in the Palestine campaign, in what today is called Palestine and Israel. Furthermore, troops which were captured in the East Africa campaign, as the Allies, particularly the British and the French, tried to occupy the colonies which the Germans had in East Africa. It should be mentioned that although these troops were captured, the Germans won the campaign in East Africa and retained their presence until the armistice. And there were some other people, and I will be describing them in detail later on. And you can see, therefore, how the population was built up, and the different colors represent different nationalities. Now, this is showing us our Maltese islands in relation to the location of the camps which I have mentioned, and we must immediately focus our attention on the Cotonera area. The Cotonera area included most of the facilities for prisoner of war accommodation, and I will go over these individual locations in a moment. These camps were obviously part of the military infrastructure of the British. The Verdala barracks were used previously to house British soldiers and British officers, and the same occurred for the areas known as Fort San Salvatore and what became known as the Polverista barracks. And I have already mentioned St. Clement's Camp, the tent city. Here we see another somewhat more detailed representation of these camps. Remember that ultimately you are seeing an area which housed well over 2,000 individual human beings. And the status of the camps was determined by the status of the prisoners. There was a somewhat very rigid allocation of accommodation based on the status. And this was based upon what was then interpreted as the Geneva Convention. First-class prisoners were housed in relatively salubrious accommodation formerly occupied by British officers and troops. And these included the Verdala barracks, as I've said, and the new Verdala barracks. Second-class citizens, second-class prisoners, which generally included non-military personnel, but were of a higher social status and needed to be taken care of, were also housed in barracks. Most of the rest were housed in tents. The St. Clement's camp housed well over 1,500 people, and I shall show you photos of these this tent city in a moment. The Polverista area, the Polverista camp, was initially designated for female POWs. There were many women amongst the POWs, okay? Some of them were individual women without husbands. Most of them were women who were accompanying their families when they found themselves interned. The Polverista camp was initially known as the St. Nicholas camp, and it was renamed Polverista in there's a mistake there, in 1916. And it was used to house new POWs as these continued to arrive and the other accommodation overflowed. Fort San Salvadore was mostly used for prisoners from the ship the Emden, which I have already mentioned. I am now going to go over some of these groups of prisoners who have more interest than others and who have been studied more assiduously. And I'm going to start with the prisoners from SMS Emden. SMS Emden was a German warship. It was laid down, it was manufactured in the town of Emden and named after that town, and in Danzig in 1906. It was completed in 1909, and to cut a long story short, when the war started, it was on location in the East Asia Squadron, guarding the colonies which Imperial Germany had in China. I bet many of you didn't know that. Imperial Germany had colonies in China. They issued their own postage stamp. In 1913, its captain was appointed Karl von Müller, and he took command of the ship, and he then took the ship raiding Allied shipping, practically all British shipping in the Indian Ocean. The two photos you can see here is the Emden itself and the complex photo underneath. You can see there the Indian subcontinent, Sri Lanka, what was then called Ceylon. You can see the Malay Peninsula, the parts of what we call today Indonesia, and you can see the cruises which the Emden took through these dashed lines which you can see over there, over the course of which the Emden captured or destroyed over 24 ships. Very efficient. Here we say 2 postcards. You're going to be seeing a lot of postcards in this talk. But these 2 postcards were not actually produced in Malta, but they show what happened to the Emden. And here we have the connection with Australia. Captain Waller took the Emden to raid the Cocos Islands, then as now a dependency of New Zealand, where he landed a contingency of sailors to destroy British facilities. There he was attacked by the Australian cruiser, His Majesty's Australian ship Sydney, on 9 November 1914. This was a very powerful ship. It quickly inflicted serious damage and forced Muller to run his ship aground to avoid sinking. Of a crew of 376, 103 were killed. Most of the survivors were taken prisoner. They were shipped to Colombo and then to Port Said before finally arriving in Malta on 6 December 1914. You can see up on the left a pictorial representation of the battle between Sydney and the Emden. Actually, HMAS Melbourne was also involved, but it was Sydney which bore the brunt of the fighting. You can see another beautiful postcard of the Emden with Captain Muller. You can see a picture of him. We'll see him again soon. And on the bottom left, you can see the wreck of the Emden on the Cocos Island rocks after Muller decided to run the ship aground. And now we come to Malta. And like the other prisoners, and you will start to appreciate this more and more as I go over the talk, the prisoners of the Emden immediately started to set up what you might call a social presence in the camps. And here you can see a postcard, and this is where we start seeing postal history material produced in Malta. You can see a postcard of the members, of some of the members of SMS Emden doing gymnastic exercises. You can see on the right again Captain Muller looking at them with obvious approval. And you can see them near the bastions of the Cotonera area where they were imprisoned, where they were housed, doing some gymnastic exercises. Now, these postcards which you're going to be seeing are going to be of two types. There's going to be postcards like this one, which are photographic postcards. They show photographs of activities or of people, and they were produced by photographers, some of which were also prisoners of war, upon request by the prisoners in most instances, and they were produced for commercial reasons, for sale. This particular photograph is from this particular postcard is from my own personal collection, and I will be showing you many others, some from my collection, some from collections of other people who have kindly allowed me to show their material and which I shall acknowledge at the end of this talk. The most distinguished of the prisoners of war from SMS Emden was a prince. Although in the Emden he was actually a simple sailor, he was actually Prince Franz Josef of Hohenzollern. The Hohenzollern were the imperial family of Germany, just as the royal family of Britain are called the Windsors. The imperial family of Germany, at that time headed by Kaiser Wilhelm II, were the Hohenzollern dynasty from Prussia. He wrote a book, Prince Franz Joseph, because Prince Franz Joseph was actually the nephew of the emperor. He was therefore a very important prisoner. He wrote a book on the Emden, and it contains a chapter on his life as a prisoner of war in Malta. I have read sections of this book, available in another book, which I will show you later. He was not very impressed by the treatment of the prisoners in the camp in Malta, but I suppose no prisoner enjoys being in a prison. You can see Prince Franz Joseph in this again photographic postcard. He is there crouching on the on the front, although it's not very clear. He's holding a little dog. And I have blown up to the best of my ability to give you some better idea of what he looked like. Not only did the Emden prisoners of war conduct gymnastic exercises, but they also had a choir, which apparently was very good. And they used to hold concerts for themselves and for the other prisoners of war. And here we can see a very fine postcard, not from my collection, I wish it was, a very fine postcard showing the choir of SMS Emden. And as you can see from the back of the postcard, which is shown on the upper half, this was used as a postcard by one of the Emden sailors to write to one of his connections in Germany, a relative or a friend, to give him news about how he was doing. And you have there the translation. He's written there, "Dear friend, we have a big concert every Sunday, which is held by 18 men, consisting of prisoners of war, and also a singing club of 30 men. Otherwise, I'm fine." Pretty much like a normal message in normal circumstances. Okay? You can see that this is what we might call an upbeat message. It's a cheerful message. It's a positive message. And for the first periods of time, there was a great deal of one might call liberty for these prisoners. They were even allowed, according to some records, to get out of the camp and go to Valletta and shop and so on. However, when Ensign Fickensteer of the Emden and an Austrian civilian internee escaped and tried to make their way to Italy, which they succeeded with, all the privileges which the prisoners enjoyed were lifted, and there were restrictions imposed, and the prisoners were guarded more vigilantly. Continuing on the Emden, this is a couple of postcards from my own collection, which I was fortunate enough to be able to acquire about 5 months ago. I have to tell you that this material is very expensive. It is expensive because it is scarce, and it's also expensive because people like me look for this material all the time, and therefore there is fierce competition in the online auctions which are held of this material. So I don't want to tell you how much I paid for these, but I hope that when I'm dead, my children will be able to sell them for at least what I paid. Now here we have 2 postcards, and they were sent by Seaman Joseph Quadflieg. He was a sailor on the Emden. And the first postcard is actually a Maltese postcard, a normal Maltese postcard showing a scenic depiction of the landing stage in Slima, what today we call the Slima ferry. Okay? You can see this depiction. Remember, we're talking about over 100 years ago. So this guy, Seaman Joseph Quadflieg, bought one of these postcards, and he sent a message to one of his connections in the city of Hamburg in Germany to give him the details of where he was. We have this in German there. It was not translated by myself, it was translated by a colleague, who I will mention later on, and to say which was his prisoner of war number. Remember the number, very important to identify them, because this prisoner of war number was very important for them to actually receive correspondence from their relatives and connections from outside Malta under the Convention of Prisoners of War. They received and sent correspondence. You can see, and I will not go in detail on this because it's another specialization, you can see the special postmarks applied stating free from prisoner of war. Prisoners of war were not charged postage for the correspondence which they sent overseas. In those days, people were more humane than they are now. Now, I want to draw your attention to the second postcard showing a group of obvious military individuals, most of them, and Joseph Quadflieg is actually that person standing up, second from the left, with his very elegant sailor's cap showing SMS Emden on it. And this postcard he sent also to his connections in Germany, much later though, in 1918, as he was approaching being released. Another very interesting postcard which came my way last year is a postcard sent from Malta again by a person called Johannes Kyle, and Johannes Kyle was the captain of another ship. He was a captain of the Rostock. This was not a warship. You can see a picture of the Rostock in the upper half on the left. On the lower half, you can see a group of individuals, some of them in obvious nautical officers' costumes. And this is taken in Malta. We know this from the imprint of Kassar, who was one of the photographers producing these photographic postcards. And this was sent by Johannes Kyle, the captain of the Rostock, to his brother. I'll come to it again in a second. I'll tell you something interesting about the Rostock. The Rostock was a merchant ship. Upon the war, it was captured and itself seized by the British in Port Said in Egypt and moved to Alexandria and was renamed the Hansmoor. Many of the crew were sent to Malta as prisoners, and this Hansmoor, which was previously a German ship and became a British ship, was sunk by the Germans a few years later by a German torpedo, which is rather ironic. 20 of the crew when the ship was sunk, remember these crew were British, lost their lives, including the master, as we call the captain in a merchant ship. These are the details from the POW register of POWs in Malta. This register is available for research. These are the details of Captain Kyle. You can see here the date when he was arrested, where he was arrested, port side, when he arrived in Malta, where he was born, etc., etc. And very interestingly, this is the ship's manifest. And the ship's manifest is simply the list of the crew and the passengers carried on the ship. Okay? This was before there was the war and the ship was captured. This was on another cruise of the ship. But you can see on the bottom of this manifest the signature of the captain. The captain had to sign the manifest. And you can see next to it the back of the pictorial postcard which I acquired, which I have shown you. And you can see that the signatures are identical. And this proves without any doubt that Johannes Kyle was indeed the captain of the Rostock. The most famous of the POWs in Malta was somebody who actually, when he was captured, was not famous at all. And this was a lieutenant, an officer on a U-boat called Karl Dönitz. The U-boat was sunk, he survived, and he was put in the prisoner of war camp in Malta. And you might think that, well, so what's famous about him? Well, Karl Dönitz ended up the Grand Admiral of the Nazi Empire's submarine fleet, and when Hitler was about to kill himself and wrote his testament, he named Dönitz, surprisingly, his successor. Surprisingly, because Dönitz, although he was undoubtedly a Nazi, was not very high up in the Nazi hierarchy, but by then Hitler had lost all faith in all his other subordinates like Goering and Himmler, and he knew that Goebbels was going to kill himself as well as he, and so he named Dönitz. Dönitz had the glorious period of 17 days as Führer of the German Reich before he ordered the absolute unconditional surrender of Germany. During the Nuremberg trials, Grand Admiral Dönitz was sentenced to 10 years in prison. So he survived that experience and wrote his memoirs. I am now going to make an advertisement for our, as I said, the Malta Study Circle, our society which specializes in Maltese philately and postal history, because in this spring edition, which has just been put out, you will also find information on the two cards which I have discussed with you, which I have acquired recently. I have written myself an article showing all the details about the card from Captain Johannes Kyle, and my good friend Mr. Roger Evans of the Society has given an update on the World War I POW cards, which includes the very beautiful card from Joseph Quadflieg of the Emden. So this Journal Melita is sent free to all of us who subscribe to the Society, but this journal should be of interest to anybody who is interested in the history of Malta, because it contains a lot of articles on postal history, and I know that the editor, Dr. Paul Policino, would be very happy to make available an electronic copy for perusal, and I hope that it will entice you to subscribe to our journal. It is really a magnificent philatelic journal, considering the size of our society. Now I want to talk about, I told you that the first type of cards were pictorial cards. They were pictures, they were photographs of scenes, of individuals, which were then used to make postcards for the use of the prisoners. But there's another type of card, and these are what I might call the diagrammatic cards. These are cards showing not photographs, but other types of scenes, such as, for example, Christmas greetings. Here you can see, this is from my own collection, a Christmas card showing in German, Happy Christmas and Happy New Year. These were designed and produced by the prisoners themselves. And they were used, apart from the obvious use to send to their relatives, they were also used to generate a little revenue. Because remember that these people were practically penniless and didn't have any money for any comforts additional to the, let's say, scant comforts accorded to them by the prisoner of war authority. So there is this card, very valuable card. Here are another two Happy Christmas and Happy New Year cards. You can see one for the Christmas and the New Year of 1916. And you can see down written, from your dear Papa. And this is another card showing the same Christmas 1917 to New Year 1918, showing a number of individuals with the military uniforms which were used by the different branches of the German military in the camps. Observe in the background the tents. I'll come back to the tents in a second, but this shows the tents of St. Clement's camp. And here now you can see St. Clement's camp in reality. You can see the type of tents which were used by the over 1,500 individuals who eventually passed through this tent city. This is a minor city made of these large tents. Obviously, more than one individual occupied each tent. They were allocated on the basis of their nationalities and according to their relationships. And this is a card, this time a photographic postcard card, which is saying, Happy Easter from Malta. The card on the right is perhaps even more endearing. This is a prisoner-produced card. It shows us the Easter Bunny. Even the Germans then had acknowledged the Easter Bunny, and you can see the Easter Bunny holding a letter with the prisoner of war postmark on it for Easter 1916 and saying Happy Easter, the Easter Bunny. This is from my personal collection, and it is one of my most cherished cards because I think it shows an element of humanity and also humor of these individuals who, irrespective of what you might have thought about their cause, were extremely, I think, able to face up to the circumstances. Observe also in the background barracks and tents. And here is a very interesting, this is from my collection, this is a card which I bought which was unused. I bought it unused. It is not easy to get. It shows a pen ending drawing of St. Clement's camp. Observe the long rows of tents. So this is a depiction of the city of tents, St. Clement's camp in 1914. I generally try to find cards which have been used because they give us more interest from the postal history aspect, but of this card I was only able to find this unused one. I will now talk about a couple. I have spoken so far about groups. I will talk about a few individuals. This is Mr. Alois von Weissmann. He was actually a small businessman. He was, if you like, exported from Egypt and incarcerated in Malta. At first he was in the Verdala barracks, and then they decided that this guy was not high up enough in the social hierarchy to be put in the Verdala barracks. So in 1915, they shoved him into St. Clement's camp. And I have correspondence from him objecting to this. But what we see here is very endearing. Here you can see a photographic postcard of Alois taken while he was in the camp, which he sent to his family, to his wife and 2 children. And I'll tell you where they're from in a second. And there you can see his wife and 2 children reciprocating in a card which they sent him themselves in 1916. I have several others of these cards. There are many of these cards involving the Weissmans. It's not too difficult, or rather less difficult to find. I find these very endearing, showing the importance of family in these difficult circumstances. Now, Weissman, where was he originally from? Well, he sent his letter, you can see a letter here, to a place called Late Meritz. All right? We'll come to a second where Late Meritz is. So here's Weissman. He's obviously from either Austria-Hungary or from Germany. But he's sending it to his family in Late Meritz. Let's put him aside for a second and come to George Mack. George Mack, or probably George Mook, sent his card to he received a card actually from Muttersdorf in Bohemia. In Bohemia. Now, this card, you can see this card, it's a very militaristic card. It's got a depiction of the head of the German armed forces at this time, General von Hindenburg, who ended up being president of Germany, the last president of Germany before Hitler abolished the post. So he was also interned, and he was from Muttersdorf, Bohemia. Now let's look at a map. This is a map of what we call today the Czech Republic. In the First World War, the Czech Republic did not exist. What existed was Bohemia and Moravia, which were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, these colored parts of this map of today's Czech Republic, all right, this is a map of today's Czech Republic, show what we call the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland were those parts of the Czech Republic which were occupied mostly by German-speaking individuals. And the Sudetenland is very important historically because it was one of the reasons that Hitler moved Europe towards the Second World War. Hitler demanded in 1937 that the Sudetenland, which contained mostly Germans, should be made autonomous or absorbed within Germany. And as a result of the famous or infamous Munich Agreement, he got his way. The important thing in relation to our talk today is that both Alois and our friend Mr. Mack, both were Sudeten Germans. You can see that Late Meritz, I have indicated it on the map, was part of the Sudetenland, and so was Muttersdorf. Today, these are part of the Czech Republic. They are called Litoměřice and Mutentin. There are no Germans there anymore. After the Second World War, all the Sudeten Germans were expelled from the newly constituted Czechoslovakia, and had to find their way somehow or other to Germany. Another of the tragedies of war. But it is interesting to note that in terms of nationality, what we had in the camps was a very mixed bag, because the empires were not homogeneous. The Austro-Hungarian Empire included what today we call the Czech Republic. It included Hungary. It included what today we call Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, all these parts. And we had prisoners from most of these geographical areas. I'm now going to talk, after having spoken about non-Maltese, I'm going to talk about Maltese. And I'm going to talk about the brothers William and Alfred Gatt. William and Alfred Gatt were two Maltese who had military careers in the early part of the last century. They were both in the British Army. William and Alfred, they were artillery officers. They served in the First World War. For example, William, who is the more well-known of them, and I'll tell you why in a second, he served in Egypt in combat and in the Dardanelles, and he became severely ill from dysentery and had to be carried back to Malta. Now, we are very much interested, particularly in William Gatt, because we can consider that William Gatt was the father of Maltese philately. at a very young age, William started to collect stamps. And you can see him on the left here as a relatively young man, still in his early 20s, as a young philatelist. He started to collect stamps. He also started to deal in stamps. I have material showing William's price list of Maltese stamps of that time. You can see William in the center in the uniform of a captain of the Royal Malta Artillery, and next to him you can see his brother Alfred Gatt. We therefore recognize William particularly as an important figure in Maltese philately. But why is he relevant to this talk? He's relevant because Captain William Raphael Gatt also served for some time as the assistant provost marshal and eventually the commandant towards the end of the POW camps. You can see here a very smart and distinguished looking at this time Major Gatt, when he was actually the adjutant of the Governor General. All right? And you can see two items. The first one is an item of correspondence using stationery. This is what prisoners of war used as an envelope if they wanted to send a letter rather than a postcard. You can see no stamp required, and you can see free from prisoner of war. However, and you can see on the left bottom corner the initials of Willie Gatt. We know that these were his initials. But what is interesting in this is that the address is also in his handwriting. And one would suspect that William took a bit of an advantage in his position as the commandant of the camp to use the camp's stationery for his own personal use. We forgive him absolutely willingly. More interestingly as well is the document, which you can see on the lower right-hand side, which is a pass issued by the commandant for movements to and from the Verdala barracks. And you can see there that this was also issued by William Gatt. You can see Captain Assistant Provost Marshal. You can see his signature over there. Another interesting person, we have been talking a lot about the photographic postcards. Many of these were taken by an Austrian photographer. He was an internee. He was one of the people interned in the camps. He was a photographer, so he took photographs of the people in the camps. Obviously, he wasn't doing this for free, and produced the postcards, many of which I have shown you already. This is a picture of Theodor Kaufler, this photographer, on the left, in his little room in the Verdala barracks. And you can see on the right some objects, some carved wooden objects carved by the prisoners during their sojourn in Malta. These people had a lot of activities. You'll see another one which is very interesting in a second. But they carved wooden objects. They painted. They wrote articles and books. This, as I said, was not a static community. It was a very interesting community. It is important that we retain, as some of us have done, our knowledge of these individuals. What else did they do? The German POW camps issued a newspaper. They issued their Camp Nachrichten, which means camp news. And I am indebted for these pictures and for this information from two individuals. First of all, from that great icon of Maltese militancia, Dr. Albert Ganado, who celebrated his 100th birthday last year. Dr. Ganado is an absolute legend and an icon in many aspects of Maltese militantia. He is without any doubt the biggest global authority on matters such as the maps of Malta, but Dr. Ganado is also a postal historian and has assembled collections, many of them containing unique items, as well as written a lot about Maltese postal history. And he has written in an article which I used for this part of the talk, he has nearly complete sets of this newspaper, which was published by the camp POWs. And in this they had news. They celebrated, for example, you can see the second on the upper row, they're celebrating the birthday of their Kaiser, and they also had humorous pieces about issues such as the quality of the food when they didn't like this. You can see a picture on the lower left of them producing some of these artifacts and crafts which I spoke to you about, and the one on the lower right shows an ironic cartoon of when they used to have shortages of water. It's basically saying we need an engineer to repair our water pump because we're not getting any water. Water shortage in Malta is, I think, a historical continuity, and of course in those days they didn't have reverse osmosis plants. So water shortage was an issue. Another very important piece of academic work on this newsletter, which is today nearly forgotten, was done by a student some years ago, Mr. Dylan Ajus, who wrote this as an academic thesis for a degree in the university. It is available free, you can download it. I really recommend its perusal because I think that Dylan Ajus did an enormous service to Melitensia by giving us all this information and this research on this newspaper. Now, as the war approached its end and ended in November 1918, obviously, we needed to get these people back to where they had to go. So, over the course of 1919, gradually the prisoners started to be released and repatriated. But there were substantial problems. Why? Well, one of the reasons was that the countries which they had originally come from had changed. For example, here is a letter, from a person who was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who is writing to Mr. Ajus, Esquire, in Valletta, in October 1919, asking for his help in repatriation. Mr. Ajus was the consul of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia very soon. And he was also in charge of Czechoslovakian interests in Malta. And therefore, this guy, who was of Czech extraction, needed to get repatriated, and he had problems because of his issues, and he asked for help with the desired letter to acquire his release and a pass to go on up to Italy. Very interesting. Now, my last part of the talk is going to focus very quickly on some particular internees, and these were Turkish internees, which were interned in Malta after the armistice. Following the end of the war, the Allied forces continued to occupy Turkey and were opposed by a nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal is also known as Kemal Ataturk. He is the father of modern Turkey. He was famous during the Gallipoli campaign when he basically rallied his troops time and time again and repulsed the Allied forces. The new Ottoman parliament met on 16 January 1920. His nationalist movement had a majority, and the occupying British didn't like this. So they occupied Istanbul, which was then Constantinople, and nationalist Turkish MPs and other eminent individuals were arrested. The British gave the excuse that this was because of involvement in the Armenian massacres, which was a reality, the Armenian massacres, but in reality, most of these people had nothing to do with the Armenian massacres, but were because of opposition to the Allied forces. They were deported to Malta, where they were interned in the former Polverista camp until October 1921. This is one of them. This is POW 2789. Observe the number, 2789. Kadir Abdul Himli. He was a major in the reserve of the Turkish army. He went back to Turkey on the 25th of October 1921. On the upper part, we see in Turkish a very rare card sent to him from his connections in Turkey. Cards sent to these group of prisoners, these Turkish internees, sent to them are very rare. So are cards sent from them to their connections in Turkey, but somewhat less hard to come by. And you can see that in the card on the lower left of the slide, there is a message to his son. It is actually in French, so one could translate it, and you can see what he's writing there. He hasn't received the money or the carpet which had been sent to him, and he ends by kissing his eyes and those of his mother and the hands of his grandmother. Very touching. Here is an important Faik Bey, an important Turkish internee, because on the 6th of September 1921, just before they were released actually, there was a mass escape. And there was a ship sent, organized by the Turks who were in Italy. There was a ship sent. The 16 Turkish internees broke their parole, jumped on the ship, and went to Italy, where exit visas were issued to them. And this is a card which is sent by one of these internees who subsequently escaped. It's not from my collection, I wish it was, which is interesting because of the connection to the escape. Here is a very interesting piece of information. This is the only baby, you can see here on the left a postcard, nothing to do with the Maltese postcards I've shown you. This is a postcard showing a baby born in captivity. This is the only baby born in the huge community of prisoners of war and internees. She was born to her father, who was a doctor, who was bought as a British prisoner of war. This lady, Professor Dr. Nermin Ertedug, was the first Turkish anthropologist, the first Turkish scientist in 1944 to receive the title of associate professor in the field of ethnology at Turkish University, a very important and famous Turkish academic, publisher of several books and nearly 100 articles in her area. So she's entitled to claim Maltese citizenship. And I am approaching the end, and I really do thank you for your patience and attention. So, to summarize, the end of the prisoner of war camps. The prisoner of war camps operated until the departure of most of the German detainees in November, sorry about the mistake, 1919. Once this occurred, all the remaining prisoners were consolidated in the Verdala barracks, and the other camps were closed. By mid-February of 1920, I keep making this mistake, the remaining POWs were again rehoused in the Polverista camps. These, as I have said, were mostly post-war Turkish detainees. They were repatriated during October of 1921, not 2021. They were the last of the 59 Turkish inmates, and that brings to an end our story of prisoners of war and internees in Malta during the First World War. Malta had a peaceful and prosperous First World War. Many Maltese made a lot of money. In fact, when the war ended, there was a huge recession in Malta, and this led, in fact, to the demonstrations which led to the 7 Giugno, because when the military activities wound down, the population didn't have as much wealth. But that's another story. So, Robert and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. That is all I had to say for you this evening. I am willing to take any questions which you may have.